Hey y'all, welcome to chapter 7. I've gotten a couple funny comments and just messages about the P-Rogue incident. It's been pretty funny. I was able to laugh back at it too, and you can laugh at it also. Um, let's hope I can remember it throughout the rest of this book. All right, so let's start on chapter 7, Perils in Paradise. All right, here we go. Oh, it doesn't even pronounce it for me. Just want to make sure I said it correctly. All right, here we go. April 7th through May 24th, 1805. Bursting with confidence, the explorers plunged into their second season of travel. They had tested their know-how along hundreds of wilderness miles. Why shouldn't they feel confident? Hadn't they struggled all the way up the river from St. Louis and weathered a winter colder than anyone could imagine? Didn't they have the most powerful rifles ever made? Why, the men in the Corps of Discovery felt they could overcome any peril in the wilderness. Traveling against the Missouri's current still took strength and patience. But the heavy, awkward keelboat had been sent back to St. Louis, and the river travel was a little easier with pirogues and dugout canoes. I want to make sure I said it correctly.
Pirogue.
We got it, guys. I don't know why it looks like pirogues to me, but pirogues. Okay. Leaving Fort Mandan, the explorers traveled west through the flat country of the northern plains. Small groves of trees lined the river banks. Away from the river, there wasn't a hill, a tree, or even a shrub to block the view. Although the prairie soil did not get enough rain to support the trees, this was a fertile country. The rich grasslands nurtured the vast herds of grazing animals, buffalo, elk, and antelope. Immense flocks feasted on the insects hovering over the prairie blooms. Each day the hunters returned with plenty of game. The men were astonished by the abundance of animal life. For a frontiersman, this was a paradise. Seamen helped hunt for the groups of food supplies. Antelopes often crossed the river, and although they were very fast runners, they were weak swimmers. The explorers watched both wolves and bears catching the antelope in the water. Seaman copied the wild animal's method of hunting. He would dive into the water and overtake a swimming antelope, bite the back of his neck, push it under water to drown it, and tow it back to the men on shore. These wild geese were so plentiful that hunting them was easy. Seaman often caught more than his share of dinner. Since the animals of the northern plains saw a few people, they were not afraid of the explorers. One evening, while taking a walk, Lewis came upon a buffalo calf. The calf looked up from its grazing but didn't run away. While Seaman came bounding up from the river, the calf snorted and darted close to Lewis for protection. Lewis was amazed when the calf followed close to its heels, like a pet, until he got back to the canoe. The other men had similar experiences. Sometimes they had to throw sticks and stones to a group of buffalo to clear them out of the way. On the afternoon of April 13th, one of the expedition's boats almost met a disaster. Charbonneau was steering the white pirogue when a sudden wind blew up. He panicked and turned to his side of the white pirogue against the breeze. The boat leaned over so far that it looked like it would capsize, and Seaman slid overboard into the river. Lewis sprang to his feet and called out directions. One of the men shoved Charbonneau aside and quickly turned the boat to the wind. Others hurriedly pulled down sail. Sorry guys, this is getting to where my face is covering the paragraph. Seaman treaded water near the pirogue. He kept his eyes on Sacagawea, who had a baby strapped on board to her back. When the Indian woman scrambled the opposite side of the boat so her weight would help shift the boat back to an upright position, Seaman swam around the pirogue and stayed close to her. I'm looking at the image right here of what's going on. As soon as the pirogue was righted, Seaman swam to the side and the men pulled him aboard. When he shook the water off his fur, cold droplets sprayed everyone. "Stop that, Seaman!" The men hollered. brushing off their clothes. A few of the men chuckled, relieved that nobody had been hurt and none of the supplies washed away. Sacagawea covered her mouth with her hand, thinking it wise to hold a grin from her husband. It was, after all, Charbanu's mistake which caused the difficulty. Charbanu crouched at the stern with the back end of the boat, annoyed with himself and everybody else. Relaxed again, Seaman dozed while the sun dried his coat. I'm going to see if I can make this bigger for me, y'all. And I do not know how to do that while recording, so try later. Lewis, maybe there it is. Lewis shut his eyes and gave a silent prayer of thanks. Although the boat was scarce and could turn over at any moment, the memory of it and the thought of what might have happened lingered the rest of the day. The White Pirogue was the steadiest of their boats, so it was used as the flagship of the expedition's small fleet of 2 pirogues and 6 dugout canoes. It carried all the captain's papers and instruments, as well as the medicines, gunpowder, and the most valuable trade goods. The 3 men who could not swim always rowed in the White Pirogue. Sacagawea and her infant son also rowed in this boat. If the White Pirogue overturned, it would be a tragedy for the corpse of Discovery. The safety of the White Pirogue was not the only concern facing the corpse of Discovery in the new country. When the explorers left Fort Mandan, they were eager to test their courage and firearms against a grizzly bear, an animal unfamiliar to them. The Indians at Fort Mandan had spoke of these fearsome bears, gigantic in size, with silver-tipped fur. During the long winter nights at the fort, the explorers heard many hair-raising tales about grizzly bears. The Indians said that they were hard to kill and extremely aggressive. In fact, the Indians said they prepared to hunt grizzly like they prepared to go to war. The corpse of Discovery began seeing signs of grizzlies 4 days after they left Fort Mandan. On April 14th, Clark spotted 2 grizzlies running in the distance. A few days later, some unarmed men caught sight of one. On April 28th, the men saw 4 grizzlies and shot at them. Although one of the bears was wounded, the huge animals ran off. The next day, Lewis and another man were hunting along the river in camp. Seaman began to bark, the fur on the back of his neck bristling. His barking was deeper and louder than any of the explorers had ever heard. He dashed out of camp, running furiously after Lewis. Lewis and the other hunters heard 2 grizzlies crash out of the brush, and both men fired. The grizzlies roared, and one of the wounded bears turned and ran off. The other wounded grizzly charged. Amazed by the animal's fearlessness, Lewis quickly loaded his gun with powder and a ball. Although Lewis had hunted many black bears in the eastern United States, he had never seen a bear charge with such fury. Seaman raced towards his master, his body pressed low to the ground and his legs pumping so fast as they had ever moved. Before the dog could reach Lewis, both men managed to reload their guns and fire another round at the charging grizzly. This time the large bear fell to the ground. The air was filled with the stink of bear and the smell of gunpowder and the tang of fresh blood. Seaman approached the fallen bear with a stiff leg walk, sniffing cautiously. Lewis poked at the huge mound of silvery brown fur with his rifle. He was astounded by the animal's size, thick claws longer than a man's fingers, and gleaming teeth the size of chess pieces. It took several men to haul the grizzly's enormous carcass back to the boats to be butchered for meat and grease. Less than a week later, Clark returned from the hunting with a much larger grizzly and an even more frightening story. "Meriwether, we shot 10 balls into this monster," Clark exclaimed, "but he swam halfway across the river, dragged himself onto a sandbar, and roared for 20 minutes before he died. Oh, the commotion he made! It was enough to make Hercules tremble." Lewis lifted one of the bear's huge front paws. "This is a mountain of an animal," he exclaimed, the spread of his fingers measuring the grizzly's deadly sharp claws. "With these claws, he could rip open an elk like he was slicing butter." "I bet this grizzly weighs at least 500 pounds, Clark said, shuddering. When the men butchered Clark's grizzly, they discovered 5 rifle balls lodged into the bear's lungs. The animal should have died instantly. On May 11th, another wounded grizzly chased a hunter half a mile to the river's edge. The terrified man shouted at the boats and the pirogues, and the pirogue pulled over to rescue him. The bear ran off through the trees, and some of the men went into pursuit of the wounded animal. They chased it almost a mile through the thick brush. Although the bear had already been shot through the lungs, it managed to run a mile and a half before dying. 3 days later, the explorers had their 4th and worst encounter with the wounded grizzly. This time, one bear fought off 6 men. With 6 musket balls already in... I have to sneeze. Oh, sorry about that. With 6 musket balls already in him, the bear chased the hunters to the river. 2 of the men jumped aboard their canoe, and 4 of the hunters hid among the trees to reload. The hunters kept shooting, and the enraged bear chased 2 of the men off the side of the bank and down a 24-foot drop into the water. The bear plunged into the river after the men. He had almost reached the swimmers when one of the hunters finally shot him in the head. It took a total of 8 balls to bring down the beast, and the hunters had become the hunted by the time the grizzly was killed. Now the explorers understood why the Indians at Fort Mandan feared the grizzly bear. The grizzly was the terror of the West. Lewis wrote this in his journal, that he would rather fight 2 Indians than 1 grizzly bear. In spite of their wilderness skills and the powerful guns, the explorers were finding unexpected perils in this paradise. The river's unpredictable winds continued to pose a threat. Charbonneau was steering with the white pirogue on May 14th when the wind picked up, and suddenly, again he panicked. Unfortunately, both captains and seamen were on shore. Although the captains shouted directions, the wind drowned out their voices. They watched helplessly as the pirogue tipped. Seamen leaped into the water and began to swim for the boat. As the crew scrambled to recover control of the pirogue, water rushed over its sides, and it swept some of the papers and instruments overboard. In the midst of the confusion, Sacagawea calmly stood and reached over the side of the boat. She snatched the lost articles out of the river. By the time seamen reached the boat, the crisis was over. The men helped the dog scramble aboard the pirogue. They scooped up the water out of the boat and laid out the wet articles to dry. That day, the captains decided Charbonneau would not steer the white pirogue again. Although their respect for the translator had fallen, they were very impressed with his wife. Sacagawea had stayed calm in every crisis. She had proved herself as brave as any men in the corps. The explorers knew how tricky boating on the Missouri was, and they had been warned about grizzly bears by the Indians at Fort Mandan. But the next peril in the wilderness surprised everybody in the Corps of Discovery. Beavers were plentiful along the Missouri River. Their thick, soft pelts were worth great sums of money in both the United States and Europe. Beaver meat was a welcome addition to the explorers' diet, and beaver tail was a favorite dish. As they traveled, the men shot at beavers or set out traps for them. The hunters saved hides to sell when they would return from the wilderness, since the beavers never charged at the men, and since seamen easily retrieved the wounded beavers from the river, none of the explorers considered beavers to be dangerous. On May 19th, one of the men shot at a beaver in the river. As usual, seamen leaped into the water to retrieve the game. Then the dog dived underwater to grab it. The wounded beaver bit one of Seaman's hind legs. Seaman surfaced the beaver in his jaws and swam toward shore. A red trail billowed out behind him. With a limp body and a dead beaver clamped in his mouth, Seaman scrambled onto the bank, and he began to hobble on 3 legs towards the hunter. And we're going to pick up here on the next video, y'all.